original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the McLaughlin Group. Our guests this week are the familiar faces of Eleanor Clift, Clarence Page and Pat Buchanan. And our guest this week is Kerry Pickett of the Washington Examiner. On that note, we shall get to our first issue, which is issue 1, police reform.
Sometimes you'll see some horrible things like we witnessed recently, but 99.9, but let's go with 99% of them are great people.
As protesters in various cities called for defunding the police and radical reform to policing in America, President Trump took a different approach this week. But with rising murders across the nation, mayors face a difficult choice: how to balance protester demands with action that keeps communities safe.
Pat, we've seen this week the striking dichotomy between really quite significant democratic efforts to pursue major police reform and yet also skyrocketing murder rates in cities like Chicago and Los Angeles and areas of New York. What say you in terms of where this is heading?
My view is this: the defund the police movement, which was a left-wing movement, there was immediate backfire against it, the backlash against it. Joe Biden rejected it. The polls showed the American people want the police by 80% funded fully. You've got people talking about we're calling 911 and getting a social worker. So the debate has moved on to a more serious level where Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats in the House have their program, parts of which are going to be unacceptable to the Republicans. They're going to have the chokehold outlawed in it and other reforms. But I think where this is going to wind up is between the two parties battling. And it's going to be decided in events like that horrible turnout in Chicago, where 80 people were shot on the weekend, 23 of them murdered and killed. And if these keep up and attacks on police keep up, I think what you're going to get is a change in the mood away from sort of the 100% pro-reform.
Eleanor.
Well, Pat, you're still counting on the protests to turn violent, but it seems to me the peaceful demonstrations have made their point. And you talk about the left wing, this and that. Well, I'm going to talk about the president dispatching his son-in-law, which is his key advisor, to Capitol Hill to work with Senator Scott, the lone Republican senator who happens to be Black, because they are going to scramble to come up with something that they can pass. The demand for bans on some of these horrific procedures, the chokehold, the non-knock warrant, when they're looking to make a drug arrest, which led to the death of a woman in Louisville, Kentucky, which is Mitch McConnell's home state. The Republicans are going to be anxious to pass something. Everybody's getting on the side of police reform, and this is a good thing. These are common sense reforms, and the slogan, defund the police, should not be taken literally. It has actually been done in Camden, New Jersey. It means you fire everybody and then you rehire people and you have them take psychological exams, et cetera, et cetera.
Clarence, there is a debate about that Camden version of reform versus, as elements of the protest movement in Seattle want total disbandment. Where do you see the politics of this going?
Well, liability protections, first of all, have been overused and abused. This is a difficulty. It gets to the larger issue of police unions and the fact that this is the one union that's really popular with Republicans because it's so unpopular with everybody else. Cases like the McLaughlin case in Chicago and others, we've seen the union become an impediment to accountability for police. That's their job, to protect their members. But we're starting to see now some pressure going the other way. And now union leaders are actually engaging in discussion with House Democrats, for example, as they're trying to put together some kind of a real accountability bill.
Kerry, your thoughts on the politics of this?
Well, first off, as far as the qualified immunity situation is concerned, remember, if you are going to have this situation of making sure that police officers won't have any qualified immunity whatsoever, then police officers, or rather potential police officers, may think twice about even joining the force whatsoever. And then you have to think about, well, what if then people start saying, well, then why is it that even judges should have any sort of qualified immunity? They end up releasing criminals all the time. People will start saying, well, why is it that even someone like Governor Cuomo should have any sort of qualified immunity? He ended up allowing, say, COVID patients to go into nursing homes. So be very careful about throwing around qualified immunity, because people will start wondering, why is it that some people or some professions should end up having qualified immunity thrown out and others end up retaining it. So I have a feeling that's going to be a huge sticking point. That's something that is not going to be able to even get any sort of passage whatsoever.
The way this is going to be settled, in my judgment, is really in the federalism, in a federalist way. I mean, Eleanor's right. There are 16,000 police departments in the country. There are 800 or 900,000 police. If the folks in Minneapolis want to fire everybody on the police force and then rehire some, that's their prerogative, and they ought to do it and live with the consequences. The same if you've got tough line police forces in some areas and people like that. But my guess, in the long run, we've had tremendous numbers of these episodes, Trayvon Martin and others, and this latest with Mr. Floyd. And you've had others, and when you do, you get a tremendous passion for reform and change, et cetera. But that dissipates when you see cops that are shot, like they were shot in New York. And the cops, and frankly, I think in the end, the cops are the winning side of this issue in the long run.
I just want to say it's rare that I get it. Eleanor is right from both Clarence and from Pat, so thank you. And I think it shows there is common ground on this issue. And I think that the protests are going to continue, and they've got to get some positive reinforcement, and reforming police procedures that are long overdue is going to happen. And what amazes me is you've got everybody out there with their cell phones, and every day we get a new video clip of a police person abusing someone. Some of these have been really horrific. So the sense that they have that they're immune from consequences, I don't know if liability can be reformed to that extent, but you got to strip them of this notion that whatever they do, there are no consequences.
All right, quick comments from Clarence and Kerry, and then we'll move on.
However, keep in mind, though, that while definitely bad cops should definitely get consequences, you have to remember that there was at least around 53 cops who were shot fatally. I believe that was in 2018. And people seem to forget about that. You had incredible testimony that was done by the sister of a federal law enforcement officer who was killed during the riots. That also happened to a St. Louis police officer during the riots. People tend to forget about this.
Clarence, your quick concluding comment on police reform.
Well, this issue is going to be with us for a while, I think, though ultimately it is a local issue. We haven't mentioned Compton, California, and other municipalities that have tried something like this or are in the process of doing it. This debate's going to go on, particularly on the local level. But the fact is, we wouldn't be talking about this right now if it weren't for all those thousands of marchers out there, the peaceful protesters who really put this back on the front burner. And I think it will be an issue in November.
Okay. And my final comment, I think there is ground for compromise here. I think we will see it. But I think it's also important to note that a lot of the videos of police officers we don't see are those videos of high courage, professionalism, and decisions not to use force where it would be lawfully justified. Of course, the bad apples need to be rooted out strongly. Anyway, we will move on. Issue 2, COVID Part 2.
Reflecting those who say that recent protests have ended the moral defense of coronavirus-related lockdowns, President Trump plans to resume campaign rallies within the next 2 weeks. And, it seems, the Republican National Convention will be moved from North Carolina to Florida following a disagreement over coronavirus precautions. Regardless, it's clear that the coronavirus challenge remains. Arizona and Texas this week saw spiking coronavirus infections, with the Lone Star State seeing record hospitalizations.
Eleanor, we'll wait to see what happens with the Republican convention. But what do you think about the politics of COVID post-protests?
Well, you mentioned that somehow the protesters take away the moral cover of staying home. I think we're at the point where everybody is making their particular choices. And I think the feeling of getting out in the streets was appropriate and overrode the desire of many people to continue to stay home. Most of the states are proceeding quite responsibly, and you do see some spikes in Texas, Arizona, Alabama, with Oregon might have been added to the list today. And the president would very much like to move on with his rally next week. And the stock market, which the president is investing heavily in, believing that that kind of tracks his recovery, the recovery of the economy and his own personal political recovery. And it took a nosedive on Thursday on increasing reports warning about the virus making an even stronger comeback in the fall.
What we've been warned about with the COVID virus, if it is true and it's easily transmissible, we could have an enormous spike here in the next couple of weeks. But I do think, as we've talked about for a couple of weeks, that overall, the drive to open up the economy and get people out, as we saw in the protests, frankly, that momentum is going to continue. I think the American people, by and large, as a collective, have decided to take the consequences of opening up. But where, again, mildly, I agree with Eleanor, individual people are looking out for themselves, social distancing and staying home with some, wearing masks with others. But collectively, America's opening up and willing to take the consequences.
Clarence, we are seeing this. The president, wants to get out, get his rallies going. Obviously, the polls suggest, how much trust we put in the polls after 16, who knows? But the polls suggest Joe Biden widening his lead. So the president has a political expediency to get out there. Do you think, though, that there will be this sort of consensus heading into November that Pat and Eleanor at least, suggest might be possible?
Well, first, a little footnote here for all those people who say the polls were wrong. The polls were right, but the polls were looking at the national vote. They weren't looking state by state, and that's why President Trump was able to pull through the Electoral College rather than the popular vote. And that's still largely true. So I try to hold off on making any predictions about this election. Nevertheless, as far as leading up to the election, though, we do still have this COVID pandemic to deal with. I was able to get a haircut this week, but I also know everybody better wear masks and keep their social distancing, and et cetera, et cetera. And that becomes a little more difficult. I've noticed a lot more people, especially young folks, slipping those masks off more now as they're out on the street. However, I'm very concerned because Dr. Fauci and other experts say, we're just in the second inning of the game here, if anything. So I don't know things are going to be that settled. We're going to still have a sense of chaos, and that can affect the election season either way.
Carrie, your thoughts?
Well, first off, we are, shall I say, more educated, so to speak, about this virus as opposed to back in March, where this was a complete mystery. So we know more about social distancing. People tend to be a little more skeptical about the kind of information they're getting from experts, so to speak. That being said, we are doing more testing. So of course, we're going to see a spike in a number of cases all around the country, but still, you have, say, the state of Wisconsin, which is doing it the right way as far as reopening. So they're doing a lot of social distancing, but still, in the same light, they're also reopening the right way. And keep in mind, you also have California, which just very recently, you had the DOJ, which said, hey, you just had a Second Amendment protesters who wanted to do a huge 500 to 1,000 person protest way back when, and you told them no, they couldn't do it because of the whole coronavirus protest ban, and then you allowed all these protests in regards to the police happening. That's not right. Be very careful, California.
Okay.
Well, there's a difference between receiving a permit and getting a request and people pouring out of their homes onto the streets spontaneously. So I don't think those two equate. But I would point out that the notion of everybody behaving the same way is ridiculous, but there is no leadership from the White House. And the fact that Vice President Pence would tweet out a picture of himself at the Trump campaign headquarters with it looked like hundreds of people in a rather small space, nobody wearing masks. I mean, what is this? Some sort of tough guy imagery? I mean, I think it is a lack of leadership. That is not. We're not getting real leadership out of Washington.
No, Tom, I know we've had these spikes in various places, but I'll tell you what is a good gauge, and that is the Washington Post has on the front page and inside in its website the deaths from COVID-17, and COVID-19. And what they show is that in April, mid-April, it got up and spiked above 2,500 a day in many cases. But now I've followed it very closely, and it's down to about 1,000 a day. And this is the reason that folks are saying we're going to get 100,000 more by September in 90 days or so. But I do think, as we talked about, in a way, this is what the American people have come to accept. Unless there's a huge spike in that, I think the idea that we're going to go back into lockdown is highly, highly unlikely.
Clarence, your concluding comment.
Well, I would agree about the lockdown. The administration has indicated that they don't have an appetite for that. We know President Trump doesn't. I'm waiting to see. We were talking last week about the impact of all those protesters out on the streets during the pandemic. I think our next conversation is going to be about all those folks turning out for Trump rallies and what the impact of that will be if there's another spike afterwards. So we'll see.
Kerry, very quickly, your comment.
Well, I still think, though, that what we're going to see is probably more people likely not wearing as many masks going out into the streets simply because, why? The weather. You're going to have more people being a little more frustrated at the fact that the government who told them we are going to make sure that businesses are going to reopen, we're going to do it safely, and frankly, if the government tells them, well, you have to shut your businesses down, I have a feeling a lot of people are going to be rebelling. Watch for that.
Okay. I think the old days of lockdowns are coming to an end. People had too much, which I think is why those protests grew so quickly in the beginning, even though there were many people who still find them a very necessary and righteous cause. Anyway, we'll move on. Issue 3, China.
The Republican Study Committee, the largest caucus of Republicans in the House of Representatives, this week called for wide-ranging sanctions on Chinese influence operations in America. But that's just one concern. As tensions between Washington and Beijing grow over issues such as the political status of Hong Kong and Chinese territorial seizures in the South China Sea, some are saying that an overt Cold War is now well underway.
Clarence, it's been lost in all of the coronavirus and protest attention, but the significant moves that the Chinese government has made to assert control over Hong Kong, how do you see that playing out in terms of the foreign policy of the United States in the presidential election towards the most powerful second nation on earth?
Oh, ask me a hard question, Tom. I think, no, this is a very important question, really. And since, it's the kind of question that people lose sleep over, and for good reason. Now, President Trump doesn't seem to be that much worried about the prospect of Cold War. He's still rattling his sabers as he used to. But at the same time, he wants to keep China trade going. And I don't expect him really to take us to the brink on this. He has a way of proving me wrong, but I think he would rather deal with matters closer to home right now if he can.
Well, the president has lashed out at Hong Kong, saying that the U.S. no longer respects their special relationship with China. Now, he's doing that to punish China, actually, because China was pushing national security restrictions on Hong Kong. But he conducts foreign policy by just lashing out and, I'm pulling out of the World Health Organization, I'm punishing Hong Kong. I don't see any grand strategy, but if you read the articles about the protesters in Hong Kong, they feel like if there's a new Cold War, they're Berlin. I mean, they're the pawn between the two superpowers. And I don't think that's a great place for Hong Kong to be. And, I personally would be rooting for Hong Kong, as many Republicans are. Marco Rubio has proposed that the protesters get the Nobel Peace Prize. So, if the president has a strategy, I don't know what it is other than to try to get himself reelected, and he needs to have an enemy, and China fits that bill.
Your thoughts?
On Hong Kong, I've got different thoughts. I think you're going to have to realize and accept the fact that Hong Kong is not going to be independent, democratic, and free. And you accept that. And if you're not going to get that, you ought to stop the violent protests or the street protests and the rest of it, because all that's going to bring is a Chinese crackdown, and the Americans will retaliate by cutting economic ties, and the ultimate loser will be the people of Hong Kong, many of the wealthy of whom will flee to Singapore. So I don't think we want that. We don't want a Cold War with China. There's no doubt, Tom, we've talked about this before, there's tiny islets and reefs in the South China Sea. Not one of them belongs to us. None of the 6 or 7 other nations are willing to go and fight for them. And we don't have to fight their war as long as we've got our rights of access and passage through the South China Sea.
Okay, Kerry, your thoughts on China?
Look, you already had the Chinese Communist Party already worked around the Hong Kong Legislative Council to put this seditious act, so to speak, to essentially mess over Hong Kong. So at this point, probably because China is in a very bad situation in terms of COVID-19, the best thing to do is probably just to put these sanctions onto China, because they're in a pretty weak spot at this point. And you had all these Hong Kong protesters who were risking their own lives, not thinking about the GDP, but really thinking about their own freedom at this point.
Okay, and Clarence, one of the things that's noted, Pat talks about the South China Sea, as he well knows. My view on that is that if you don't try and constrain the Chinese, they will use it to subjugate the political and economic interests of those regional nations and control the vast amounts of global trade through them, making us less wealthy. But anyway, that's my view. Do you think there is a political interest on the part of the Democratic Party, Pat's laughing, to join with President Trump in some of the more robust tariff-like measures that he's imposed, if Biden were to win, for example?
If Biden were to win, would President Trump want to join with Democrats? I don't think so.
No, I mean, would Biden replicate President Trump's tariff policy with China?
No, that's a good question. Biden has been tougher than Trump actually in the past on this, but it's very hard for me to gauge at this point. But I think just considering Biden's past practices, he would want to put some kind of sanctions on to try to rein China in, seeing that indeed China is looking for more and more dominance in that region, and we would have an interest in trying to keep them at bay. To what degree remains to be seen.
And the degree is the devil in the detail there, because it potentially pertains to military force. So we shall see on that issue. I'm sure it's going to come back. But on that note, we shall move on to predictions. Pat.
We've seen the Confederate generals and soldiers torn down in city after city, the statues of them. You've seen others, statue of Columbus has been beheaded in Boston, dragged down in Richmond. And I think Winston Churchill's statue was, the word racist was painted on it. Colston up in Bristol, statue was thrown into the bay. I think what we're going to get is a real cultural war here involving attacks on the explorers of the New World, the founding fathers, the generation of slavery in the United States, and the segregationists, and demand that statues be brought down all over America. And it's going to split the country, and it'll split the Democratic Party.
Eleanor.
Well, talking about culture wars, the president is going to Tulsa, Oklahoma on Juneteenth, which is a day that means a lot, especially to Black Americans. And Tulsa, Oklahoma is the site of a white uprising, mob violence against Black people 99 years ago. And what it reminds me of is that President Reagan, candidate Ronald Reagan, opened his 1980 presidential campaign in Neshoba, County, Mississippi, which was right near Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the 3 civil rights workers were murdered. Now, I don't know what messages, I know the message that Reagan was trying to send, and I suspect I know the message that the Trump campaign is trying to send. I think it's going to be received very differently in 2020 than it was in 1980.
Okay, Kerry, your prediction.
The anti-lynching legislation, this bill that everyone is getting upset with Rand Paul about. Well, Tim Scott, he said that he's one of the original authors of the bill this year with Cory Booker and Kamala Harris. Well, he said that he will talk with Rand Paul, try and make the language a little better so it won't necessarily include slapping, something that Rand Paul had big problems with, wanting to make sure that the bill is about anti-lynching. So it looks like it's probably more than likely going to be passed very soon in the next must-pass bill.
Great. Clarence, yours.
Well, as you know, Gone with the Wind that's being shelved for the time being as well in this current culture shift. And I predict, you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen, there will be a push to have Amos and Andy released by CBS, keeping it under lock and key since the mid-1960s, except for academic purposes. I personally see no reason why it shouldn't be allowed to be released for a commercial viewing. Henry Louis Gates has said similar things. And so I said, just wait and see.
Okay, very good, very good. I predict that Vladimir Putin will learn that he should have kept a better eye on some of his more high-end military equipment in Libya. Some of that has come into hands of another country, which we will learn is the United States. Anyway, thank you for watching, and we will see you next week.